Back again for another exploration. This time, we're diving further into Carl Jung's Red Book. We'll be looking at how Jung navigated his inner world, especially this idea of serving your soul, his struggle with relying too much on intellect, and his experiences with what he called the other.
So we're returning to this really unique work. It's good to remember what the Red Book actually is. You see, it's Jung's very personal account of his visions and the dialogues he had with figures from within. This deep dive into himself lasts from 1913 to about 1930. It wasn't until 2009 that it was even published.
Yeah, for years it was kept private.
Exactly. And when it did finally come out, you can imagine, it caused quite a stir in the psychology world.
It really did. I mean, some people found it pretty hard to square with his more scientific work. This very personal, almost mystical side of Jung.
Right, because it was such a departure from purely intellectual thinking. It was like he was stepping into a whole other realm, something more, well, spiritual, you could say.
It felt like a turning point for him. So in this exploration, what we're hoping to do is get a better grasp of Jung's own struggle, how he dealt with the limits of just using his intellect when he was having these really powerful inner experiences.
That's right.
And we'll see how brave he was to even write about this journey with all its doubts and uncertainties. And maybe by doing this, it can help us all understand our own inner landscapes a little better. What do you think?
I think that's a great goal. The part we're looking at today is called Service to the Soul, which right away tells you something is shifting. Jung, remember, he was an incredibly intellectual man, yet he felt this urge to record his dreams, his visions, even when he didn't understand them at all. And the way he talks directly to this inner presence is amazing. It's like he's in a conversation.
It really is. And he's very aware of his intellectual background. But at the same time, he knows he's on shaky ground. He talks about walking on these, well, oscillating bridges.
Exactly. He uses that metaphor. He's not sure where this inner journey is going. And he's honest about feeling a little scared, a little skeptical about following this inner guide into, as he says, mists and darkness.
That's a key point. He actually says he needs to learn to lose the sense, if that's what his guide wants.
Yeah.
Just think about that. This extremely rational mind, considering the need to let go of reason.
Wow.
And he compares this to how much he relies on understanding. He even calls understanding his crutches.
The crutches of understanding.
Which really highlights the inner conflict he's grappling with.
It does. And there's this moment where he talks about a change in his viewpoint. He says he used to think of, the things of my soul as small and insignificant. But now he feels this push, this demand to see and do great things. It suggests he may have underestimated the power of this non-rational part of himself, that intuitive spiritual side I think we all have. Absolutely. And what's also fascinating is how, honestly, Jung questions this inner presence. He expresses his doubts. He almost challenges this Philemon, who represented for him this inner wisdom figure or his soul, however you want to interpret it. He even says he has to express these doubts before he can move forward.
So it's not blind faith, it's very active. He's engaging with his inner world critically.
Precisely. And through this back and forth, this challenging of his rational mind, we start to see this concept of a suprasense emerge. This inner voice hints at a way of understanding that goes beyond intellect. It's a knowing that's not just based on logic.
And Jung, who is still leaning on those crutches of understanding, feels like he's lagging behind. He's struggling to get a hold of this higher way of knowing.
And this leads him to a really profound realization about direct connection. He discovers he can talk to this higher power, his inner guide, without anyone or anything in between. He doesn't need gurus or priests.
It's a very personal, very immediate experience.
Exactly, but he doesn't just passively accept this connection. He insists on his right to ask questions, to demand explanations. But it's important to note that he's not seeing this higher power as some kind of punishing force. It's like he assumes there's an openness there.
A willingness to have a dialogue, to explain things.
But even so, it's not all smooth sailing. Jung is very open about his lack of trust. He even asks, "Who are you? I do not trust you."
He's so vulnerable in that moment.
It's powerful. And he even ties this internal struggle to his ability to trust other people in his life. It suggests that this issue with trust goes really deep for him.
It's a big deal then, when he finally admits that his soul belongs to his friends too, and that it deserves his trust. He realizes he hasn't treated it fairly, he's underestimated it, and he realizes that he has to abandon self-criticism and learn to love this part of himself.
And this journey inward, it's not always a walk in the park. Jung talks about how approaching the soul can be scary. You can feel like you're losing your grip on things, falling into chaos and meaninglessness.
I can see why that would be frightening.
He says this fear is natural because this chaos is like the other half of the world.
But then he says something really interesting. He says, disorder and senselessness are the mothers of order and sense. It's this paradox. It suggests that true meaning can come from confronting the messy parts of our inner experience, like when you're struggling with a problem, a jumble of thoughts, and then suddenly, out of the mess, you have a breakthrough.
Exactly. He talks about the need to marry chaos to the order to create something new, the divine child, he calls it. It's a powerful image.
It is.
It shows how something creative can come out of what seems destructive. But, of course, it can be scary to open yourself up to this chaos.
He even suggests that we might have a skewed view of God, focusing too much on the loving, Christ-like image. He talks about encountering a soul, an errant, loving soul, and feeling horrified. This makes him put up a wall of doubt to protect himself. It makes you think that maybe our ideas about what's good, what's divine, aren't the whole story.
And Jung argues that we shouldn't try to avoid fear and doubt. He says there are tests to go through. We need to figure out why we're afraid, why we doubt, to push past the limits we set for ourselves based on what we think we know.
So it's about moving beyond intellect, beyond our past experiences.
Exactly. He talks about acting out of free will, not just giving into temptation. This, he says, is how you become truly free and go beyond Christianity, which I think means moving past dogma and finding a more personal connection to the spiritual.
I see.
And this leads Jung to a major realization. He needs to not just accept what scares him, but to actually love that which horrified him.
He has to love it.
He connects this directly to self-acceptance. It means those shadow parts of ourselves, the things we hate about ourselves, are also part of who we are.
It's a powerful idea.
And he uses this really striking example of a saint who, even though he was disgusted by the plague, drank the pus from the sick and found it tasted like roses. It's a metaphor. It shows that redemption and grace are tied to the soul. It might mean facing the things we find unbearable.
That image is intense. It really stays with you. It makes you think about what we consider unbearable and how those very things might hold the key to change.
It does. And then he brings up this unexpected idea about virtue. He says, if your virtues prevent redemption, discard them, for they have become evil for you. It's a challenge to rigid morality. It suggests that sometimes our egos cling to being good in a way that blocks real growth.
So the things you think are your strengths, your principles, could actually be holding you back.
Exactly. He goes on to say that someone who's a slave of virtue is just as lost as someone who's a slave of vice. Both are trapped. It suggests we need to find a more natural, integrated way of being, not just forcing ourselves to be good.
Not being a slave to any one idea.
Right. And this leads us to the main idea here, serving the soul. Jung says, if you believe yourself master of your soul, then become its servant. He points to great leaders who served others as an example. True power, he suggests, comes from humility and devotion to something bigger than yourself.
So it's a paradox. To master your soul, you have to serve it.
Precisely. Then Jung describes a time of real inner turmoil. He says, the spirit of the depths fell on me. Oh. He's caught between fear, stubbornness, and disgust. He feels overwhelmed. At first, he resists this pull into his inner depths.
He doesn't want to go there.
But this spirit of the depths gives him crucial advice. Gaze into your depth, pray to your depth, awaken the dead.
Awaken the dead.
Jung feels lost. He doesn't know what to do. He looks inside himself, and all he finds are these old dream records that seemed meaningless at the time.
It's interesting how these things he didn't think were important become his lifeline.
Exactly. And when he thinks about going back to the light of day, giving up on this inner work, this spirit insists he return to himself. It emphasizes how important this inner journey is. So while Jung is dealing with this lack of trust in his own inner voice, think about those times when you've doubted your own intuition, even when it felt right.
It makes you wonder.
This is where the chapter ends, and we learn the next one is called the desert, which implies he's still in this place of solitude, encountering more of his inner world. The things we see in service to the soul, fear, doubt, humility, the struggle of surrendering to the spiritual side of yourself, they set the stage for what comes next. And it's from this questioning, this pushing against just rational understanding, that the idea of a supersense starts to form. It's a different way of knowing, beyond just intellect. You know, the feeling of sinking into meaninglessness.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something a lot of people go through when they start looking inward? What helps you navigate that fear? based on what you've seen in Jung's journey?
Looking back at this part of Jung's Red Book, there are some really powerful ideas that stand out. We see this tension between our intellect and our inner experience. The importance of asking questions, even doubting, when you're on a spiritual path. We see how we need to embrace both order and chaos, because they're linked. He even challenges how we see virtue, saying it can be a problem if it blocks us from becoming whole. And finally, he points to this idea that to really understand and master yourself, you have to serve your soul.
It's a powerful thought, and I'd like you to consider your own connection to your inner world. How do you deal with your doubts and fears? How do you balance thinking things through with trusting your intuition? Are there things you believe are good, are virtuous, that might actually be holding you back from truly knowing yourself?
It's something to think about. What if the things you think make you strong, make you understand the world, are the very things preventing you from experiencing yourself and the world more deeply and authentically? What could happen if you, like Jung, questioned everything and embraced those parts of yourself that seem chaotic, irrational? It's definitely something worth exploring.